We're on. We're getting started. Hi, welcome everyone to the first 2000 Days webinar. Thanks to everyone who's online. We'll be taking questions and comments online, so if you can't hear or there's an issue with the audio, please let us know through the chat or the Q&A function on the webinar technology, and otherwise we're going to pass it over to Lana Clark, who's going to introduce Dr. Lynch.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. We're so excited to have Dr. Susan Lynch with us here this morning. She has been the lead of many early childhood programs throughout her career, and we're lucky to capture one of the last career moments. I hope I'm not letting anything out of the bag there.
Not at all.
Where she's going to give us some highlights from her work with the ECMap project and some of her work with the Community University Partnership. So, Dr. Lynch, we'll turn it over to you for your thoughts and wisdom around this topic.
Well, thank you very much, Lana, and I really appreciate this. I've just lost the screen signal here, so
it's coming back.
There we are. Okay, I hope that's all okay for everybody online. Again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate being here and seeing several of you face to face where I may not have met you before. For those of you online, I want to welcome you as well. There were several names on the list of people online that I recognize, and it's nice to be able to talk with you even if it's not face to face. What I've done is prepared a presentation that has I've packed it full of a lot of the content from the ECMap project. I won't necessarily cover all that content because there won't be time, but I'm hoping that I can hit the highlights, and then any questions or comments that you have, I can dip back into the slide set and show you detail if you'd like to. My plan is to make some very definite breaks in the presentation where I can ask you if you'd like to ask any questions or make any comments or observations about the work. So the first break will come at about 11:15 or so, wherever we've gotten to in the content. The content is broken into 4 parts. The project itself, there are many of you that know the details of the project. I'll skim across a lot of that and stop at particular points where I think there might be new information for you or things that you might want to know about in more depth. The second part is really dealing with the children with special needs, but we did a separate report on those children, and I want to highlight some of the content from that report. We did an additional study as part of the project that we called Learning from the Wisdom of the Community Coalitions, and I'm going to review some of the findings from that work as well. And finally, what I want to do is deal with the recommendations that we made and what seems to be happening now or about to happen in terms of next steps around all of this early childhood mapping work. In order to really get started, what I wanted to just remind everybody of what you already know, and that is that the experiences young children have, and when I say young children, I mean children from birth to 5. The experiences that young children have are what actually shape the developing architecture of the brain. I'm not a brain scientist, but here's my understanding of what's happening then. As you can see in this graphic, across the bottom is the age of a child in months. And see in the graphic are neurons in that first panel that are primarily disconnected from one another. They're all present, but they're not connected. And as children gain experience on a month-by-month basis, what happens is the experience connects those neurons together. And the ways in which they connect depend on the kinds of experiences they've been having. So it would be true, I think, to say that no 2 people in those early stages grow at the exact same same set of connections as each other. They are unique in that way. And because that growth is so rapid and the connections are happening so quickly and so many of them at that time, it's true that the kinds of things that we're interested in as children grow and learn actually are affected most in those first few years. So you can see from this graph that each one of the major areas of sensory development and cognitive development and emotional development have a very sensitive period in the first few years of life in which those foundations of neural connections are laid down. And they become the foundation for what happens later. I'm going to run that animation again so you can see it as each area of development is identified. So you can see that vision is very sensitive in those early years, the first 3 or 4 years. Language a little more developed later on. Emotional control and symbol system understandings, peer social skills, and understanding of numbers. The bulk of those occur in those very, very early years. The other thing that's happening, and is particular to this province, is that not only are we interested in the early years because of that brain growth and development, but because during the period from birth to 4, back up that a bit, we have the largest number of births in Canada in that period of time. So between ages 0 to 4, the increase in the birth rate in Alberta is about double that of the national average across provinces and territories. So in this province, not only do we know a lot more about the brain development, but we got a lot more brains to be worried about. The ECMap project was hatched because of the interest in what was the growing knowledge about early childhood brains and brain development, and also because of this huge number of children that were being born during that period of time. The research project had 3 components to it. First, we wanted to know more about what are the developmental outcomes or the developmental progress, developmental health of children at the end of the first 5 years of life. We wanted to know more about how the environments in Alberta that children are growing up in are affecting that development. And we wanted to know what would happen as we engaged communities and provided them with the information, how they might use that information for planning at the local level, what information they could give back to the research team to help us understand more about the data that we had and maybe more about the resources that are available locally. So I'm going to be talking about 3 kinds of data. One is the EDI data, the Early Development Instrument data that we collected across a period of 5 years. I'm going to talk about the socioeconomic status of the communities in which the children are growing up because of the effect those communities would have on families and families on the children. And I'm going to talk about the community resources that are available to assist families and all of us in the community to raise healthy young children. The first part is about the EDI. I'm thinking that in this area, this is something that most of you will know quite a bit about. There's quite a bit online, both for the ECMap, on the ECMap website, but also on the Offord Center website at McMaster University. So if you want to go deeper into what is the EDI and how does it work, there's information there. EDI stands for Early Development Instrument. It's a series of questions on a questionnaire. The questions are answered by the most knowledgeable person other than the parents. And in our case here in this province, those are the kindergarten teachers. Although there are children that are involved in other kinds of programs where we might have knowledgeable people, they don't cover the whole of the cohort of kids. It's very fragmented. We would have some children in childcare, some children only connected to the health system perhaps, So it's fragmented. So the best, most knowledgeable group of people to work on this with us were the kindergarten teachers. We collected 5 waves of data, about 1,100 schools. Overall, we had 86,000 and a half questionnaires completed by teachers on children. They completed them in waves rather than in batches all at once. We then aggregated the data, which means we clustered it, put it together in order to analyze it. The EDI tells us things about the cohorts of children. It does not tell us much about individual children. Even though the teachers fill in the questionnaire on individual children, it's not very reliable for the diagnostic and assessment of individual children. It does provide information that's reliable and you can count on it when you aggregate it for 30 or more children. It deals with physical health and well-being, emotional maturity, communication and general knowledge, language skills, language and thinking skills, and social competence. If you are looking on the Offered Center website about the EDI, they label this particular domain or developmental area as language and cognitive skills. We slipped away from that because we found when we did a little bit of test running that cognitive did not resonate with people generally, whereas thinking skills did. So we just renamed it. Once we had the data, we aggregated it in a number of ways. One of the things that we did is we grouped the data. So every questionnaire is scored. The scores then add up within each one of the domains, that is, areas of development. Once that's done, then there are national norms that give you a cutoff level of the scores. Some of the children's scores will fall above the cutoff level, some will fall below the cutoff level. So that gives the structure to the way of aggregating the data. And we aggregated it in 3 categories. Above a certain level, children were identified as developing appropriately. At a certain level, the teachers' responses identified children that were experiencing some difficulty. And then at another level, the cutoff would identify children where the teachers thought they were experiencing great difficulty. So we used those 3 categories to begin to report what we were seeing in the data in this province. And that's what I'm going to start showing you next. One of the things that you have as a handout is one that's a fact sheet called the Early Development Instrument, EDI, and how it's being used in Alberta. That gives you a little bit of detail around what I've said so far. When we began aggregating the data, we started to look at what the results are like, and that's really becomes quite interesting. I'm going to go through this in detail. For those of you that have worked with this data already in communities or in some of the professional work you may do, these pie charts will be familiar. But I'm going to walk through them anyway, because on this hangs then some of the information that we have about how the children are doing in this province. The green panel represents those children developing appropriately. The blue patch refers to those children who are experiencing difficulty, and the orange patch refers to those children who are experiencing great difficulty. When you aggregate these 2, you get an overall percentage of the children who are experiencing some or great difficulty in each one of the developmental areas. You will find, by the way, that this number here is different in some of our reports, because once we finalized all of the aggregations, we found that there were more children involved here than we had thought. So it was a matter of actually sorting out which of the children had special needs and not, and setting those ones aside and then recalculating the data. But the numbers are close enough to the same that it's not a huge problem for you. When you look at these, you can see that about a quarter of the children, and in this instance approaching a third of the children, are having some kind of difficulty. They do not fall in that category of developing appropriately. We were curious to find out if the children that are developing appropriately in each one of the categories were the same children. That is, if a child is developing appropriately in one area, is he likely to be developing appropriately in the other areas as well? And when we looked at these numbers, we said, well, they're pretty close to each other, so the chances are that these are the same kids. What do you think? I see people shaking their head. For those of you online, there's people around here that are shaking their head. I don't know about you, but you're right. Had I guessed before we analyzed the data, I would have said the majority of those would have been the same kids. That if you're healthy in one area, the likelihood that you're healthy in another area is pretty good. Well, I turned out to be quite wrong. Here's what the data actually showed us. 46.4% of the children were developing appropriately in all 5 areas of development. All the other children were experiencing difficulty in one or more of the areas. This surprised me. I would have said it would have been up around 65%. So I was quite surprised. This is less than half of the children in our data set. That is not, in my view, a happy story. And if we took instead of the green and asked the same question of the orange, the question would be, are the children who are experiencing great difficulty, that's that orange piece, great difficulty in one area also likely to be experiencing great difficulty in the other areas? In this work, we had some national data that we could also look at. So we were able to compare the answer to that question for Alberta with Canada, which gave us an additional piece of information. So here's what it looks like. If we said experiencing great difficulty in one or more areas of development, in Alberta, the percentage of children in that category is 28.9%. That is considerably higher than any of these numbers here. So we know that if we're thinking about children experiencing great difficulty in one area, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, we get quite a high percentage. That's approaching 30%. If you do the math, multiply that times the 70,000 plus questionnaires that we had in the data set, that's a lot of kids. And experiencing great difficulty means that they are below the 10th percentile. Compared to the rest of Canada, which sits at 25.4%. We asked the further question, what about children who are experiencing great difficulty in 2 or more areas? So the children experiencing great difficulty in one area, we said, set that aside, that group aside for the moment. Let's look at all the children that experienced great difficulty in 2 or more areas. Well, we found almost 15% of the children. And again, in comparison with the Canadian norm, the data there, it's 12%, 12.4. So again, it's not a happy story. We should be doing a lot better than that in Canada and in Alberta, a lot better. So I've got some takeaway messages for you, and then I'm going to just stop for a bit of a break and invite you to ask me questions or make observations. Less than 50% of Alberta's children are developing appropriately in all 5 areas of development. And nearly 30% are experiencing great difficulty in at least one area of development And we fall both significantly below the Canadian norm in all of those stats that we've looked at so far. I've got a fact sheet that was provided to you online, and I think is available here, called the Baseline EDI Results for Alberta. So that's something that gives you just a little bit more of a summary. And it's the kind of thing where, you know, you might find it useful to provide it to other people, or you may be doing a presentation yourself and want to pass on information in a paper form that people can use. So it's a fairly straightforward one. So are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to make at this point? Yes.
Are there any outlier provinces where the children are performing really, really well?
The question, I'm not sure if people can hear, so I'm going to repeat the questions. The question was, are there any sort of outlier provinces or territories where the children are doing really, really well? I don't know the answer to the question directly. You can get some of that information by going onto the offered website. The problem is that each province manages the EDI questionnaire and data differently. So it's a little hard to tell. Where I do know some of the provincial data, the province of BC, which keeps the special needs kids in the data set. So, you know, you have to take that into account. They are dealing with experiencing great difficulty on one or more at about 32%. So what would happen if we took the special needs kids out the way we did, I'm not sure, but they would be about the same as us, I think. In Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they don't have any really recent data that I know of, but their children were doing a little bit better than what we would see in the Alberta statistics. In Ontario, it's a much more fragmented picture because they pick up data in blocks and analyze it and report it. And you can't tell what would happen if they had all of the province involved. In the maritime provinces, I'm really out of touch. I don't know at this point. It's an interesting question, though, because you can find out from the outliers. So what if, you know, if they're doing really well, what are they doing right? What can we learn from them, you know? Yeah, Phil?
So we know that ours don't include the special ed, the special needs children, and they also don't include Aboriginal unless they are in the public system, but not on reserve.
That's right.
It would only include Aboriginal children who would, if you were to break it out that way, who were declared on their registration form for public school, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just run through that because it's a very interesting question. Then I'll tell you a little bit about a side project that we were doing that gives us a bit more. But if a youngster was going to school in a kindergarten classroom on a reserve school, that data is not included because the reserve schools did not agree to participate. The people on reserves were very interested, the communities were very interested, but there were so many obstacles to getting involvement that, for example, all of the kids had to have active parental consent. That's true across the whole province. On the reserve, there also had to be active community consent, and that was very difficult to figure out how to get. The Aboriginal kids who live on reserve but go to school off reserve, their data is included if their parents gave consent. Aboriginal children who live off reserve and go to school off reserve, their data is included, and that includes Métis kids on the Métis settlements. There's a couple of other groups of kids that aren't included. One is Hutterite colony kids. There are no kindergartens on the, I think I'm right when I say all the Hutterite colonies, but there may be a couple that do have kindergartens. But there weren't kindergarten teachers that we could go to partner with to collect the data. And it meant that the kids, if we collected the data, were already grade 1 age. So they were already 6 and beyond, which then is outside the age range of analysis. So we couldn't use them. There were no other overall groups that aren't included other than the special needs.
So, and are we the only province that requires active consent as opposed to passive consent?
Yes. In this province, and we did try to go for passive consent. In this province, the Privacy Commissioner ruled that active consent would be needed, which means that the parents must have filed a signed document with the school authorities that they agreed to have their children's data as part of the project. We worried about that, but thank goodness for the kindergarten teachers, because they went out and they convinced parents to sign the documents and submit them. They held parties about the project. They connected it with their natural consultations they do with the parents all the time. They went door to door in some cases. We wound up with an 88% participation rate because of the hard work the kindergarten teachers did. And it had an interesting side benefit, and that was that the parents wound up knowing an awful lot about the project, so that when community engagement was part of what we were trying to do, there were people in the communities that knew what was going on. And that turned out to be a great advantage. In the other provinces, the province of Nova Scotia toyed with active consent at one point and decided not to. They all went with passive consent, and their consent rates were all 100%. So there was nobody, not a large enough number to even show up, of people that wrote in the document back to the school authority, I do not want my child involved. So it's kind of an interesting story around that.
And Sue, my last comment is about your stat there about less than 50%.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was with United Way, we did a presentation to their board of directors just after the report had come out.
Uh-huh.
And it was interesting when you were able to make the analogy that if they were in business and they had a product coming off the line that was supposed to operate in 5 particular ways, and only 50% of the products going off the line did operate that way, how long would they stay in business? And that's when they got the aha moment as to how important early childhood education is.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting, isn't it? And if you put on the business hat and start to look at the data through that lens, you get some interesting thinking. I'm thinking about the handout that we've got available called What's the Payoff? And it really is about, if you do not act to prevent some of these abnormalities developing in children, then you pay a lot downstream with incarceration, poor health, school dropout, I mean, on and on and on. And again, there's a bit of an aha moment for some of the folks around that too. I kind of hate to portray young children as being, as our work with young children being primarily about getting them ready to be, widgets downstream.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's the only way you can start the conversation with some of the folks in business.
We have a quick question here, Sue, from online around the number of questionnaires received and putting some context around that. So the question was, did other provinces also have 70,000 results to look at? But yeah, just some context around that number.
Okay. I'll tell you what I know about it. I'm not, I don't have a lot of information about it. The number of questionnaires really depends on two things. How many children are there actually enrolled in a kindergarten in any one year? And then second, how many did they try to gather information on in any one year? So there are some provinces that gather all of the information all in 1 year for all of the children in kindergarten. So they don't do it in waves the way we did here. And of course, a province like Ontario or Quebec has many, many more children in their kindergarten enrollment in any 1 year than we have. We have about 40,000 in any 1 year, 40 to 45,000, and growing. And BC would be about the same number, and they try to collect all their data in 1 year, so they would have about 45,000 questionnaires. But they're not always able to do that, so they tend to have it in 2-year waves. We collected twice in the 5 years, so that's how we got to the initial allotment of 86,000. Okay, now I can see that it's 11:15, so I'm going to just quickly go over the next few slides. We broke the province down into communities. I'll say something about how we did that later and why it was important. You can take a close look at every single community and subcommunity by going onto the website and clicking on Live Atlas. I've got the website and information on that later on, but I would encourage you to do that. It's an interactive map. It operates kind of like Google Maps. You can zoom in and zoom out. The more you zoom in, the more detail you get, and you can do it on a community by community basis, sub-communities and so on, and that'll give you more detail on that. I remind you about the 5 areas of development and the developing appropriately. I thought you might be interested in what the range is. That 46% is the whole of the province. But if you broke it down community by community by community, what does that statistic look like? It's not uniform across the province. There is a community that has 73% of its children developing appropriately in all 5 areas. And there is a community that has 16% of its children developing appropriately in all 5 areas. That kind of comes around to the question you asked earlier about comparing provinces. We've got the data here to take a look at the community by community by community statistic. And the question becomes one of why the differences? What is it that makes that kind of a difference happen? So that was a starting point for some of the work that we did. Here is what it looks like if you look across all the province. So low is a low percentage of it's low on the scale of percentage of children developing appropriately. So the red areas are places where a very high percentage of children are not developing appropriately. If you look at the green, dark green areas, these are areas where the children, many of the children are developing appropriately, a high percentage. If you look at the Calgary area here, you can see that it's quite a mix. And again, if you go on the Live Atlas website, you can zoom right in and have a close look at that. How about the other statistic of children experiencing great difficulty? There's the pattern there. If it's a green area, it means that there's a very low percentage of children experiencing great difficulty. If it's a red area, there's a high percentage of children experiencing great difficulty. And again, you can zoom in on these maps to get more detail. We also aggregated the data by sex, by age, and by language at home, whether it was one of the national languages or not. And here are some of the broad findings. Girls tend to have more positive results than boys. That will not be news to you. In terms of age, there was an interesting finding. Younger children tend to be doing less well, and that's simply developmental. They are just at a different developmental level. However, there is a cohort of children here that start school beyond the age of their own cohort. That's often, usually actually, because parents or schools choose to keep the children home for an additional year. We have in this province a different start date for every school authority. Every school authority picks their own. So we had some start dates that are so young that we've got lots of young kids in that age range. And parents in school districts often keep those kids home for an extra year so that when they start, they are actually older than the cohort that they're with. And what we found with that data was that those children do less well than children of the same age, but in a different school district that has a different start age. So what does that mean? I'm not sure. We would have to go into that data in great detail. But it put up a flag for me, a cautionary note about parents choosing to keep their kids home. That it may be that when you keep your kids home, the lack of experience with other kids or the lack of prompting that comes through school programs, who knows, it may be delaying their development somewhat. Anyway, we've got work to do. I've still got the data set aside to take a closer look at that. And children whose first language is either English or French tend to have more positive results. This gets all mixed up with the degree to which the teacher can see the language from home as being well spoken or not. And so again, it's a hard statistic to interpret. But I would caution everybody that there is something that is called the ecological fallacy. And that is, if you know something about groups, you cannot attribute that to individuals for then purposes of understanding the individual better. Let me use sex as an example. Yes, girls tend to have more positive results than boys. But if you've got a girl right in front of you, you cannot count on that girl having more positive results than the boy standing right next to her, because you cannot take the aggregate results and use them to then interpret individuals. You have to do a different assessment. Yes?
I was wondering about the girls tending to have more positive results than boys. I guess I'm wondering what you would attribute that to, given that there's also, a sense that schools don't necessarily reflect how boys learn and participate. So how much of it is the kindergarten teacher saying, well, this boy isn't developing according to these norms because he can't sit in a chair for half an hour, and how much of it do you think is actually the boys are faring less well than the girls?
Don't know. All we know is that other research that's really closely looked at boy-girl differences have found many differences. In the kindergarten cohort, the vast majority, I can't say exclusively, but the vast majority of the teachers are female. And so a female assessment of a male child may have a built-in bias to it. But we don't know, because we don't have enough male assessments of female and male children to be able to do the comparison. So there are a lot of ways of speculating about that. Whatever it is that is producing that kind of result, it is at least partly due to the experiences those children have had from birth, not just the experiences that they're having in kindergarten or in school. Because that's what's shaped the brain. It's those first 3 years that really have shaped the brain's development. There are people working on that. There are people working on what is the difference in the brain like at birth, and are there anatomical differences, that kind of thing. But I'm not a brain scientist. I just don't know enough about it.
So Sue, is there an anomaly as well, because not all, like charter schools, did you know it's whether or not they participated, or Francophone, because these are community-based, you can have a number of children going from a community into an alternative school or Francophone that did not participate, and does that skew that community's?
All of the Francophone schools, the charter schools, the private schools, and the ECS community schools were all invited to participate. All of the Francophone schools did. Most of the private schools and charter schools did. There were a few of the ECS programs that did not, and they tended to be, a child care center that had a few kids. They tended not to, but many of them did. There were no differences that we could detect depending on where the child, what kind of school authority the child was enrolled in. And we did use all of the data that they provided to us. So the results, they vary greatly across the province, and they do vary depending on sex, age, cohort, and language. We're not sure how to explain all of that. I'm going to just do some brief things about the children with special needs. Okay, there were 3 categories of children identified by the teachers in the summary page who have special needs. So what we did is we took all the data from those kinds of special needs, and we took all of the categories of analysis that we were using, and we put those together. So the things I'm going to show you, we had taken the kids who are not identified with special needs, taken them out, and we focused just on those kids that have got varying kinds of special needs. We included children that have mild, moderate delays, or this is a diagnosed, identified need, who have severe delays involving language, who have severe disabilities of the many kinds that we've encountered. That's the rough percentage of those kids from the data set that we had and that we could do the analysis on. One of the things that we found when we did the comparison across communities, so these frequencies, these frequencies here are the whole of the province. Okay? These are representing the communities. So we took every community and we looked at the frequency of children with varying kinds of special needs. Notice that for every one of those special needs, there's at least one community where there are no children identified. And we took 2 rounds of data for every community, and there were no children identified. Immediately that said to us there's something wrong with the identification system, because there's nothing in the geography of Alberta that would suggest that there is a community location that would have 0 kids with any kind of disabling or troubling kind of condition. So one of the things we think is true in this province is that we do not have a very good system for helping to identify children that are experiencing these kinds of disabling conditions. Here are some of the other unusual patterns we found. If children were diagnosed with mild, moderate, or severe delay involving language, one would think that the teacher's analysis on the questionnaire, the teacher's answering the questionnaire, would show some of those inabilities that were growing in the children. But there were lots of children, I think 23% of the children, who the teacher said is developing appropriately, despite the fact that they had a diagnosed disabling condition of some kind. So we're thinking that maybe there's not a good match between what the questionnaires are asking and what the disabling condition is about. But we don't know that. So that's an area that needs to be looked at. For the children who are in the ESL group, a high proportion of those were identified as having severe delays involving language. Now, a severe delay involving language is a diagnostic category where the children's speech malfunctions are appearing, sometimes a very delayed onset of speech. It would not matter what language they were speaking. That severe delay involving language would be there if it indeed is a severe delay. So it was very unusual to find a huge number of severe delay involving language in the ESL group. And we think maybe the teachers were trying to signal us that this child needs help in language. Whether he's got a delay or not is not the issue. He does not speak English or French fluently and needs help. So, yeah, Sammy.
Oh, I'm signaling.
Oh, you're signaling me. Thank you very much. Okay, I shall steam right along. So I would recommend that you have a look at the special needs report because of the unusual patterns we were finding there that don't make sense. And we put in recommendations about the province taking a good look at all of the tools that are used to try to identify children that have special needs, so that there's a better alignment, I think, between the way that the children are actually behaving in classes and with other kids and in kindergartens and the assessment that was done. Those recommendations are all in the special needs report that we did. So why are all these differences here? Well, one possibility is that the socioeconomic status of the communities and the families is having an impact on the children's development. So we took a look. I'm quickly going to go through this. Again, you can find a lot of this in the reports and also on the website. We took 26 variables out of the census, and we used a method of clustering the data that gave us 5 characteristics of the clusters. So some of the data clustered around economic stability of the families within communities. Some were clustered around what we called social mobility. There were some that clustered around cultural similarity. These are labels that we gave it after looking at the data. There were some that clustered around the overall vulnerability that seemed to be present within a community. And there was one that we called childcare, but I'm not happy with that label. It was, first of all, there was too little data to work with. And the pieces of the data didn't quite hang together. So I haven't put a lot of confidence in that particular one. We used this information to create a socioeconomic index. And then we took a look at the EDI as it relates to the socioeconomic index for each community. So the index could range from 0 to 100. The actual range was from 20 to 55. So every community had a an index assigned to it based on those 5 factors. Okay? And we used many different statistics from the EDI, but here's one of them. The number of children who are experiencing great difficulty on one or more. So these are the children experiencing difficulty on one or more of the domains. And this is the number of children. So if you take a good look at the graph, what you'll see is that the majority of the children experiencing great difficulty fall into the middle class ranges on the SEI, not the poverty ranges, but the middle class ranges. Most of the other work that has been done has identified a socioeconomic gradient that as the income levels increase, the positiveness of the child development increases. And that was true in our data as well. But the actual number of children is different. So here, yes, the low socioeconomic status contributed something to the poor development in those children. But look at the others. Every single community had children who are struggling, who are having difficulty. And in these communities, it's the greatest number. Okay, so we were able to look at all the children experiencing great difficulty, which is over 20,000. And of them, more than 16,000 and a half are experiencing great difficulty, and they live in middle-class neighborhoods.
Are they middle? Did you look at like the level of inequality? Do they average out to middle-class neighborhoods, or are they? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
We didn't look at inequality, and that would be a really interesting look. There's a book out called Spirit Level, which deals. It's a British research ongoing study, which deals with the gap. The income particularly, not socioeconomic status overall, but income. And they look at the gap. And when the gap is fairly narrow, the results are better. Even if the incomes are lower, if the gap is narrow, the results are better. That is a really interesting thing to kind of probe. The only thing that we found that was kind of close to that is that overall, the economic level did account for a fair amount of the variance in the EDI scores. But when you got to the community level, it was cultural similarity that popped out as being a predictor of children's well-being. So that one is really of interest to us. I would love to know more about that. That's the kind of thing where you can't really interpret the data until you can sit down with the people in the community and say, here's what the data says. What's happening? Can you explain it to us? We did that with one community up in the northeast, and what we found was the community's history was such that the cultural differences within the community were not very great. The people in the community all had a very similar cultural background, and their EDI scores were good in all areas except language. And the cultural background was not an English language or French language background. So there's a lot to be learned from this kind of work. I'm just giving you a bit of a taste of it at this point. So takeaway message here, EDI results vary a great deal across the province. The largest number of children who are living, who are experiencing great difficulty actually live in the middle-class communities. And that's an important takeaway message, because the inclination has been, in this province and others, for all of us, that if you want to help the children that are struggling, you find the poverty neighborhoods and you put the resources in there. You put the money in there, you put the activity in there, you focus in there, because you're going to help the most children. Well, it definitely will help the children, but there's a whole lot of communities out there that don't qualify as poverty communities, where there are also children struggling, and sometimes a lot of them. So we can't create policies that only deal with poverty communities. The community resources data was interesting, and I'm going to quickly flip through how we got this data. First of all, the communities became engaged and got organized, and we're really the stewards of the EDI data. We provided that to communities, and the community people were invited to become researchers with us and help us collect information about resources, particularly in the community. The way we did this is one coffee cup at a time. You recognize that, Lana?
Yeah.
We divided the province into 8 areas. Each area had, within its fuzzy boundaries, one or more people who became the contact people for that area. They then, one cup of coffee at a time, went out and talked to people that they knew. These are people that lived in the communities that we were connecting with. And slowly what they did was they built coalitions that then identified boundaries of what they called their community. On the Live Atlas site, you'll see a boundary map that shows all kinds of administrative boundaries for this province, and none of them are coterminous. So the school board boundaries public don't match separate, don't match francophone. The health boundaries don't match family service boundaries, don't match school boundaries, etc., etc., etc. So there was no set of boundaries that we could use and call it the community boundary. So we went to the people in the community and said, where would you put your boundaries? And the community folks did marvelous work. They not only set community boundaries, they said in some of them, in 66 of them, they said, we've got so many people living in our area that if we just use one boundary for it, it's going to mask the data. There'll be too much data there. We can't pull it apart. So we said, okay, find us sub-communities. And those communities identified sub-communities. So we wound up with 100 communities, and then within them, 300 sub-communities. And we broke the data down for all of those. The coalitions were formed in the communities and had some seed money available to get going, and were invited to participate in the research project. And these are some of the photos that just show some of the kinds of things that people were doing as the coalitions formed. I love this one. These are kids that designed a playground out of plasticine that would have their favorite things. So there's water, there's a hamburger, a Mighty. No, there's the hamburger. I've forgotten what that is now. And this is a blanket with the picnic all set out, and these are the kids playing. Anyway, the communities did a lot of work to spread the news about what the importance of early childhood is and about the data. We had a chance then to look at what is it that makes for a strong coalition within a community. Again, we gathered the data from the people that worked within the community coalitions. And there are 4 documents now on our website that summarize what does the literature say about coalitions and building strong coalitions. What do the people in Alberta say, who are participants, about coalitions and what makes strong ones. And then there's a couple of documents about applying the ideas, one of which is a bit of a toolkit. Sammy was involved in the development of a lot of that stuff. So what people told us was these are the things that make for a strong coalition. And these seem to be the 3 things that made the biggest difference to the strength of a coalition. Leadership, I think, probably is obvious when you've got strong people within a community that get involved and want to participate and so on. The leadership that they bring to the work in that community is it's critical. And all of you have probably experienced that. Certainly you've experienced it through First 2,000 Days. I mean, the leadership throughout, the development prior to this project, and then the engagement through the project has been critical to moving forward. Coalition members were champions for children, and that spoke to their vision and mission. This picture was actually provided for me, but it reminds me of the little girl up in Edmonton, Spider Mabel. Have you heard about Spider Mabel? She looks like that, charging forward. But coalitions charged forward as they began to articulate the vision and the mission that they were on. And it was an early childhood mission, not only a community mission. It was a community mission around early childhood. And the coming together was really very interesting. What I watched happening over the coming together of coalitions was people discovering things they didn't know about their own communities. People discovering that they had resources in their communities they might not have thought about before. They had leadership in their communities that they hadn't really thought about before. And then as the work progressed, what they began, I think, discovering was the power of working together, and the kinds of mountains that you've got a chance to move when there's the power of coming together. When the project finished and the government put in some money to make a transition year to the current state, it spoke to the power that was in those coalitions, because the coalitions survived. And that's going some. We needed to know about the resources, so we went to the coalitions and the communities and we asked them, tell us what the resources you've got in your community. We trained a mapper in each community to feed us the information in a way that would enable our central mappers to plot those things on maps. And if you go to Live Atlas, what you'll see is 23,000 resources that were identified by communities as important in raising young children. And the resources, those 23,000, if you hover over a map with the dot, each dot is a resource, up comes the information about the resource. So that interactive map can be quite useful. It is not being kept up to date. So it's the kind of thing that's a useful tool, but locally people need to be adding to it and developing it. And in some locations, like Edmonton, Calgary, you've got mappers in the city that can continue to do that kind of work. Worth bringing them on board. The interesting thing is we couldn't find a relationship between the number of resources and the EDI results. You get good results in some communities that appear to have no resources, and some communities that appear to have lots of resources, and it didn't seem to affect the results. So we don't know why, except we don't think we've got the right data. It's not enough to know that a resource exists. You have to know something about the quality and the uptake. So you can have a high-quality resource that's so small the uptake is 10 kids. You can have a potentially really good resource that could become an asset, but for whatever reason, like we found this with parks and playgrounds, it's not used. Parks and playgrounds, we found that they aren't designed for young children, and they aren't designed for parents of young children. There's no bench to sit on. There's no potty on site. There's no place you can change a diaper. There's no where you can sit and keep an eye on your kids, but not get in the way of their play. The design of playgrounds is not great. I was interested in, Phil, your comments around the Play Institute conference, the international conference that's coming, because I had a conversation with Jane Hughes about some of the ideas around the conference, and we got talking about adventure playgrounds, which both of us remember from way back when, where kids did all kinds of wonderful things and adventures, but the communities weren't too happy with them because they were kind of messy places. They tended to have dirt and mud and water and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, okay, where do we go from here? These are the labels that we put on the 6 recommendations that we made to government. What gets counted counts. If you don't keep up the measurement using at least the EDI, possibly some other things with it, and keep that data flowing over time, you don't know if all the activity and effort you're putting in is making any difference. And the school districts are in a good position to know if the EDI predicts later school performance, so it can be very useful for some kinds of planning. But the real difference is going to come in those first 3 years of life. And if the activity around those first 3 years, which we're engaging in this province, isn't making a difference, then we got to make a change. So important is keeping the measurement going. This year, the school authorities joined in the kindergarten teachers to pick up a new round of EDI. So that first round of data that I showed you is the baseline. Then each year, to every couple or 3 years, picking up that data again, we'll keep a constant measure on is there any difference that we can detect. My understanding is that about 80% of the school authorities did join in this year to pick up EDI data, but that will not necessarily give us comparable data until the other 20% have the data picked up too. Second one, if it's about us, don't do it without us. This was our plea to keep coalitions going and supported, because there is not any way that I can see where we can actually make a powerful difference in the lives of those young children without community engagement. And the community has to involve the residents in the community, the parents of the children, the professionals working in the early childhood field, the whole range of people, politicians, right within coalitions, working right on the ground. There are limits to what a community group can do without provincial policy to back it up. But provincial policy alone will not solve the problems, will not engage people without that community engagement. So our recommendation was to keep the coalitions alive, well funded, supported. So what's happened there is the Alberta Association of FCSSs has been contracted by government to make sure money continues to flow to the coalitions by way of seed grants, and I think it's an amount of about $22,500, about that at this point. And then second, to act as a bit of a backbone for those coalitions. And I would say probably especially in the areas where there isn't a backbone like 2008. And I've forgotten what the name of the group in Edmonton is that put all the hands together.
That's the Edmonton Early Years Coalition.
Edmonton Early Years Coalition. Yeah. There you go. So those two things seem to be going ahead. The rising tide lifts all boats is a plea to understand, for everybody to understand, that there are children experiencing great difficulty in every single community. And the only way of coming at bringing that statistic to a better level is by putting in universal support across all children. Because you cannot predict by the neighborhood that children live in, by the family that they have around them, by the territory they live in the province, by the geographic area. We tried splitting the data urban, rural. There's no predictability there. Children experiencing difficulty are in every single neighborhood and community and piece of geography in this province. There is not a way of saying, well, we'll just fund the programs for this little group of kids. It's got to be treated like immunization. Everybody needs to have access and be involved in immunization. It needs to be treated like libraries. Libraries are not designated for only kids that are having difficulty. It's for everybody. And early childhood development needs to be treated the same way. When we talk about any kind of programming or community development work or anything like that, if we want to make a difference in those first 3 years of life, it's got to be universal program and then some targeted programming on top of that. Clearly, a child who is experiencing great difficulty in a particular area may need more support. But you can't predict that support based on where that child lives or some screening tool. The screening tools are at that age level are not really reliable. And certainly the EDI will only give you group data. So it's our plea for universality in thinking about early childhood development support. The other one that I wanted to really focus on is the governance in ECD. there's been lots of conversation around the province, large and small communities, about how patchworky early childhood development and learning programs are. We could be looking at parent-link centers. Patchworky. I mean, the centers are not frequently located around lots and lots of families. I mean, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Their programs are focused in very different ways that are not necessarily making universal programming available. There is a need to take a look at how we govern the early childhood development and learning field, and create a less patchworked picture. Our recommendation was for the government to think about putting in a secretariat. There is in government in Alberta a francophone secretariat. The job of that secretariat, small, is to make sure that in every department of government there is consideration of the francophone fact in Alberta. So these folks are in the face, in many ways, of every department of government. I think we need an early childhood development secretariat that is in the face of every department of government. Right now we've got 3 departments involved: health, education, and human services. What about municipal affairs? What about culture? What about justice? All of those departments have a role to play in one way or another. And the fact that the citizens of Alberta depend on every department of government for all the things that we need as citizens, they ought to be able to depend on every department of government around early childhood. And the only way I can think of to do that is to have a small group of people with the mandate to go into each department and talk about early childhood development and the relationship that needs to be there between that department's mandate and early childhood development. The Department of Municipal Affairs right now is about to put in place a new Municipalities Act. I haven't had a look at it yet. I haven't had a chance to. But if it doesn't have a component in there about early childhood development, we should be all over them with our big boots. Because the municipalities have such a strong role to play in creating environments, physical environments, roadways, physical environments that in which the children grow and live. So of all of the recommendations that are in these last 4, that's the one that I think might in the long term make the most difference. With that, I'm going to stop and see if there are any final questions or comments, and then we'll shut her down. Okay.
That's great.
Blythe.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. We have a few comments coming in online. They're kind of related to the link between early childhood development as a sector, and then the link between the formalized school system as a sector. So the first one is, are there any research that supports the long-term effects of the children represented in the EDI as they move through the school system? And related, are there suggestions as to how we can form better relationships between the school system and early childhood programs, especially in terms of sharing information? So I guess one is that gap between ECD and institutionalized schooling. And then the other is, how do we actually engage with the school system to continue following this data through their lives?
Okay. With respect to the first one, does the EDI predict later school performance? Yes, it does. There's been a little bit of work done in Alberta taking the EDI data and looking at the correlation between that and the grade 3 and maybe even 6 now scores from the achievement testing program that the ministry uses. The little bit that's been done in Alberta, yes, there is a predictive score. So if children are experiencing great difficulty by the time they're 5 and in kindergarten, there's a high probability they're going to be experiencing great difficulty by grade 3 and 6. The province that's done the most work around that is British Columbia. And there's been some done in Ontario as well. I'm not as familiar with that, but in BC, they've done some pretty extensive studies of that. And what they've found is basically what I've said, only they've done a lot more work than we've done here on it, that indeed the EDI scores will predict the outcomes on their middle elementary school achievement testing program. So that's one thing. I would love to know more about whether the different parts of the EDI predict things differently. So for example, does the emotional and social development of the children at age 5 act as a predictor of academic achievement, which is measured on the achievement tests? Or is it the experiencing great difficulty statistic that does the predicting? I don't know. We've got a chance here to do some more of that kind of work in Alberta because we've got the data. So it's a matter now of putting together the projects that could actually go into the data we've already got and check it out. In terms of engaging school authorities, the experience that I had in the pilot work that we did was that when I talked with the kindergarten teachers about what we were trying to do here, the kindergarten teachers were all over it. They wanted it. They knew that by the time they got the kids, it was often too late for them to make any really significant changes with kids, and that it was going to take some very special effort, well-funded, in order to change the trajectory of those kids as they went into the school system. So they were all for trying to prevent the problems in the first place. So I found the teachers very engaged in what we were trying to do. When it came to the school administrators, it was very spotty. So the pilot project we did was in Edmonton, and the school principals from the elementary schools that participated were a real mix. Some of them were of the tradition of finding secondary teachers who were good teachers, training them in the elementary school as principals, and then moving them into administration in high schools. More frequently now, and to a certain extent then as well, I'm talking 2003 now, the principals of the schools had come from an elementary school background or a special ed background or occasionally an early childhood ed background. Those people bought in much more so. I think, though, that the real engagement that we need to be worrying about is about the engagement of the people that are surrounding the children in the first 3 years of life. So, for example, you can do a pediatric specialty in medicine and not have a course in child development. You can do a social work degree and never have touched an early childhood development course in your preparation. You can have a teaching degree and be assigned to kindergarten and never have had an early childhood development course in your background. So these are things that are contributing pieces to those early years. And if I had a limited amount of money and wanted to go after the thing that I thought would make the most difference, I would not go into what happens to kids after the EDI. I would go into what's happening to these kids before the EDI. Now, the Department of Health has got a bunch of programming going. Human Services does, so there is work being done, but it's nowhere near universal. And it tends to be targeted at one group of kids only, and those are kids living within poverty or difficult circumstances. So I'm engaging the school system. The most critical engagement is those kindergarten teachers. And they just did a huge amount of work around the EDI when we did the 5 years of collection. That needs to be maintained.
Thank you. Well, we're running right into noon on the dot, so I think we will call it a day. Thank you so much, Sue.
You're very welcome.
It was awesome. For those of you listening online, if there was any questions that didn't get answered during the call, Sue, if you're okay, I'll email them to you.
Sure.
And copy those individuals, and we could do it that way.
Sure.
And Sue has been kind enough to let us record this, and we will post it on the First 2000 Days website as soon as we're able to sort out the technology. And yeah, just want to say thanks for everyone, and mostly thanks to Sue.
Well, thank you very
much. We are
much.
so lucky to have
Thank you.
your wisdom to build from. So
Thank you, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to do this. Ask me anytime.
Okay, we will. We'll pull you out of retirement again. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
See you, sir.
Contact information.
Are you going to the
Let's see.
Great.
Good. So the technology behaved for you?
Technology
Good,
Oh,
good,
yeah, I
good.
think we're,